an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It's Thursday, May the 18th. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next. A little slow getting this show off the deck this morning, only because I just wanted to wait for a few more details on this pronouncement out of Queen's Park. The provincial legislature meeting this afternoon. Municipal Affairs Minister Steve Clark stood up in the House and made it official that, in fact, the region of Peel, the Regional Municipality of Peel, is going to be dissolved. And that's going to take effect January the 1st, 2025. So a little bit of work to be done to decouple Mississauga from Brampton, from Caledon. And a lot of things to work out. So anyway, we just wanted to kind of point to that. And I will only say that in as much as we're watching the story closely. And of course, it will be the subject of some discussion tomorrow when we convene the On the Ledge Roundtable. On the Ledge is your Ontario Politics podcast, so plenty to talk about there. It's the Hazel-McCallion Act, by the way. And, so Now and Next, normally it would have been in your inbox by now, but just wanted to make sure we had some of the details before we went on. Welcome in, Dave Trafford here. Yes, this is Now and Next for Story Studio Network. And it is Feed Drop Thursday, so we'll get to that in a second here. One thing that I do want you to do, and I know you're heading into a long weekend if you're in these parts of Ontario particularly, download yesterday's Now and Next episode if you haven't done so already. And I say that because I think it's a fairly comprehensive review, in-depth analysis of what is really the first official candidates debate here in Toronto for the mayor's chair. I apologize right off the bat. It is an hour long. It's almost like two shows in one. The first half of the show features a conversation with Neil Hetherington. Many of you will know, if you're a regular listener here, Neil is the CEO at Daily Bread Food Bank. They hosted the debate this past Monday, the beginning of the week. And then the second half of the program is a breakdown of how the candidates performed. We hear from them directly. And I provide full, long-form actualities, the clips from the debate, so you can hear how they react to one another. You can hear how they respond to the answers. It's not the full debate by any stretch of the imagination, and if you want to go and do that, that's fine. But I'm just offering a little bit of context around the commentary. You get to decide. It will be an important election here in the province of Ontario. Interesting to see how many more invitations I'm getting now to attend the latest mayoral debate. One's going to be held next week at George Brown College down on the waterfront. The next day at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. So there will be plenty of opportunity to see and hear from these candidates. The only thing we didn't get into yesterday, and I think it's a really interesting part of this whole discussion in terms of the dynamic, Mark Saunders, the former police chief here in Toronto, is running. Based on the name recognition polling, and that's all it is right now, he's running second. His name is recognized second most among the group. Olivia Chow's name surfaces at the top as the name most voters are likely to recognize. I know the pollsters say, who would you vote for? But here's the thing. They have to actually list off all of these people, so it's not like somebody's top of mind when you get to that poll. If it was just an open-ended question, who would you vote for mayor of the city of Toronto? I bet you'd get, I have no ideas. But because they have to list all the names, Oh, I know her. I know that name. I know him. I know that name. So it becomes then just a name recognition poll. That's all it is. That doesn't mean that there isn't momentum behind these campaigns. Let me get back to Saunders. He refused the invitation to attend that debate at Daily Bread. Will he be at the Construction Alliance debate at George Brown next week? Will he be at the Board of Trade event next week? I've already been told by folks who are paying attention on the inside of the campaigns, the Saunders team does not want him participating in debates because he'd get his lunch handed to him. There's no way he could stand in there and go toe-to-toe with Olivia Chow. He couldn't do it with Josh Matlow. He couldn't handle Anna Bailau. Certainly couldn't handle the likes of Brad Bradford. He would not do well in that environment. So, will he show up? I don't think avoiding the debates is going to be a very good strategy for him. So, keep an eye on all of that. While we speak, air travel, a bit of an issue. WestJet pilots likely to go on strike. So, if you had plans to fly WestJet out of Pearson International Airport, sympathies. And I say that because we traveled last week down to Halifax. Air Canada, I got to give everybody at the airport, holy cow, like if I had 4 thumbs, I'd give them 4 thumbs up. There was no delay. There was no problem. There was no backlog. Clearly, they have got the bodies in place to deal with security. The only issue that we have right now is that there's an overwhelming tendency among travelers right now. Nobody's checking bags, or as few as possible. Every flight that Air Canada had going out of Pearson, or in fact out of Halifax, the announcements were being made. Well, we're fully booked. Are there any volunteers who would happily check their carry-on so we'll have enough space, carry-on space, overhead space in the aircraft? They were asking for something, 15 people on a plane to do that. And clearly they had problems with it because there were people, had their overhead compartments full over their seat. And in one case, when we were coming back from Halifax, they just ran out of space. So they had to take all that. And there was, again, another half a dozen or more bags that they had to check because there was no overhead space on the aircraft. Just telling you. That is neatly leading us into our feed drop today, because the feed drop features the first show that Aaron and I produced here at Story Studio Network, and it's The Next Normal. The last 3 Thursdays we have highlighted and featured the show. This week, we address adaptive capacity. It was stressed and tested during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it highlighted our collective need, our ability to be resilient. So in this episode, Sarah Thorne is president and CEO at Decision Partners. She also happens to be the host of the EWN podcast, by the way. Put an ear on that. She leads our discussion for this episode of The Next Normal, and it was actually it was broadcast back in July of 2021.
Taylor, president of Challenge Factory.
The reason every decision we go to make is so difficult is because it's laden with moral hazard. We can't actually judge what's good and bad.
Dave Hardy, president of Hardy Stevenson and Associates.
COVID has really pushed us to think about what healthy cities mean.
Sarah Thorne, president and CEO at Decision Partners.
We've really acknowledged the recognition and the safety and the caring for each other because we've adopted these new behaviors.
Ujwal Arkulgud, chief anthropologist and CEO at Motive Base.
And this is not just because of the pandemic. This is because a lot of us have gained new knowledge.
Welcome back. I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford.
And we are full force into the next normal here. And episode 4, I think it's important for us to talk about, dare I say it's a bit of a buzzword, or it's becoming a buzzword, the concept of resilience, and how I think really this is a fair thing to say that it's a bit of a moving target. We don't really know what it means anymore.
Well, that's clear. And I think going into this, it's one of those things that we thought affected others, right? We thought, if you were resilient, it's because you faced some serious challenges, a physical disability, or you had mental illness, and we didn't talk about mental wellness. And resilience is muscle building. Resilience isn't about making things easy to deal with. It means that you are equipped to cope with them. And it doesn't mean it's not going to be difficult, but you're better equipped to deal with what's on the horizon.
And I think what we've learned too is that resilience is not necessarily a learned skill in and of itself, but it, like to your point, it's a practice of being able to make decisions in the short term that impact the long term. And so that's kind of where we start today's show, is with that conversation around what is it to be resilient and how do we make more resilient decisions. And Sarah Thorne is going to kick us off today with this conversation. And it's a good one.
Well, and it's also one of the other phrases I just want to throw in before we get to Sarah. We pivot on the phrase pivot, because Sarah starts talking about how we have adapted. And that's a better phrase than pivot.
I think it's really important to start our conversation today by really setting the context and talking about adaptive capacity, and then move on and talk about resilience. And I think that if we talk about these in the context of decision-making and behavior, which is really the area that I focus on, it'll set us up for our future discussions, including when we talk about policy implications and opportunities going forward. So just to sort of set the table a little bit, in the Engineering with Nature podcast that I host and Dave produces for the Army Corps of Engineers, in our 6th episode of season 2, which we did about a month ago, we were talking with Safra Altman of the Army Corps and Marshall Shepard, who's a meteorologist with the University of Georgia, about climate change, extreme weather, and community adaptation and resilience. And it will be of no surprise to anybody, the poorest communities and the most vulnerable people are the ones that experience the greatest impacts of climate change, and they're least able to adapt, and consequently, they're the least resilient to current and future impacts. So we're seeing exactly the same thing in the pandemic. Our most vulnerable people are the ones that are at greatest risk of exposure. They've suffered the greatest consequences. And to your point, Dave, we should have been prepared for that. We should have known that. And I think about the vulnerable seniors, the vulnerable personal support care workers in the long-term care homes, for example, that really suffered, and we lost so many people before we had the vaccines. And then I'm thinking about people that are living in the hotspot areas still, often low-income areas, often multi-generational homes, often with family members who are going in and out trying to make a living doing 2 or 3 part-time jobs. So these folks are high risk, high exposure, also high vulnerability. So I think it would be interesting to talk today about what have we learned so far about our own adaptive capacity, that of our families and people we have relationships with, and then talk about what are we learning about adaptive capacity in our communities and in society. And then once we've had a bit of a conversation about that, we can think about resilience. What can and should we do with what we're learning to make our families and our communities and our society more adaptive and ultimately more resilient?
You know, as Sarah's talking here, and all I can think of is that we've talked about not being ready for it, i.e. we didn't have a plan in place. We have our resident planner as a host here on the show. Dave Hardy is with Hardy Stevenson, and also is the executive director of the Institute for New Suburbanism. And I wonder how all of this sort of makes you grind your teeth, Dave, as we look in the rearview mirror and that we could have been better prepared for it, and adapting would have been easier.
Yes, thanks, Dave. My teeth are ground fairly low right now. We do have emergency plans, and we do plan for a pandemic. Most institutions do that, but we were really tested. And I thought what we're seeing is we're really missing the fundamentals, and we continue to do so. I looked at the ice storm back in 2013 and the huge power outage in 2005. We still haven't learned our lessons from that in terms of making sure we are stronger and resilient, even though we certainly have been able to adapt. To Sarah's point, though, in terms of a plan, that if you're wealthy, if you're living in the core of cities, you have no problem. You did better during the pandemic. It's those pockets in the suburbs that have really been struggling. I talked to a federal politician. I said, these people have no internet, and their businesses, employers have no internet, and Canada's largest city, no internet. I couldn't believe it, but it's the case. We have food security issues that we should be well on top of. Going local food is fine, except when there's a power outage or it's in the middle of winter. You just don't get your food through kind of those sustainability initiatives. And of course, our healthcare was overwhelmed, in particular our frontline workers, and we just don't learn those lessons. As a planner, we do plans, but we need to do an awful lot of thinking. I just don't see it going on, and it needs to.
Probably the one area where we were most adaptive and resilient was in the workplace, Lisa. It's where we overuse the word pivot, but we're all doing work now remotely as if it's normal.
Yeah, so I think that we have seen all kinds of examples of resilience, but I really want to take it down to some of the things that have happened that are the kind of the markers of how we actually have adapted. And one of the things that has struck me right from March 2020 all the way through is how focused everyone is on what the date is going to be for when they can move to the next step or the next stage, and how little planning has been done so that when we individually, organizationally, sector-wide, when we actually hit the date, we knew what to do next. So right from the very beginning of the pandemic, the headlines and the conversation has always been, is it going to be this date or that date? Or it's shifting, by one day or another. Or they said it was going to be August this, and now it's November this. The date and the actual time is actually irrelevant if we don't know what we want to do on that date. And so I think as we realize and think through what's the difference between being in the midst of a crisis and what's the difference between returning to a world of work that was already changing. Precarious employment was already a topic. Massive demographic change, already a topic. At Challenge Factory, we call that the talent revolution, and it has a 20-year horizon. What's the difference, and how do we continue to adapt when the official date of the end of the crisis passes, but we're still in revolutionary times? How do we continue to adapt and evolve in those circumstances?
Yeah, Ujwal, we were talking recently, and the whole idea of trying to figure out what to do next can't be looking in the rearview mirror. And you and your team are the ones that are sort of looking well down the road. What's the horizon look like?
Yeah, I think the big change that we've seen is the meanings around resiliency have begun to change to include a conversation about equity, thanks to the pandemic. Interestingly enough, when you looked at the topic of resiliency, a lot of the meanings revolved around dealing with personal challenges personal challenges in my life. Now, thanks to the pandemic, there's a greater recognition of the fact that the world is much broader than my own life, my own local community, what's going on within the household. And there is an increased recognition of the fact that there's an equity problem in how resilient we can be as people, and in the expectations that we tend to impose on other people without realizing that, their experiences, their background, their own infrastructure may prevent them from actually being resilient, from actually adapting the way one might be able to.
I think that I want to pick up on what Lisa and Ujwal have both said. I think, first of all, Lisa, your point about the dates is so critical, because the dates, frankly, have been irrelevant. What's really important is that we understand what the factors are that let us move to the next stage. And the communications about those has been a little challenging, shall we say. But we need to understand that there are a whole bunch of factors.
Abysmal? Yeah.
Well, I didn't say that, but Dave, perhaps I'm agreeing with you. But there are all these different factors. And in fact, what we need to do if we want people to be adaptive, which we do, and which they have been, and which they will continue to be, they need to understand all these different factors. And picking up on your point, Ujwal, I think it's one of the factors that's really important that has come to the forefront, and perhaps it's been a surprise for some people, is just how vulnerable some of the members of our communities really are. I think that the pandemic has really shone a light on that, and perhaps it's something that we're a lot more conscious of now, and hopefully more reflective. And hopefully when we think about our communities and being more resilient, we're being more holistic in our thinking and including, the whole community, not just, the neighborhood that we live in our thinking going forward.
So let me just drop this stink bomb into the middle of the conversation. And to that point then, Sarah, if we have more awareness is one thing, but I think there's a double-edged nature to this. On the one hand, we can all be more aware of it and empathetic. They may even call us to action. On the other side, we realize the depth of the problem, and I feel like I'm incapable of doing anything about it. So whether I'm willfully ignorant or not, I find myself really kind of handcuffed and not able to respond to it. And that only deepens the problem that we're already facing.
I think we saw that, Dave, in spades with the outrage that started to happen when the realization happened that there wasn't paid sick days or ways for these vulnerable workers to be able to take time off to go get vaccinated and to recover from the vaccination. And the outcry that happened over the days and weeks leading up to the modified policy that started to come in was outrageous. I mean, it was really at such a high level. Never before had we really seen such focus on what it means to be in a precarious employment situation and what the real implications are, not just to those workers, but to everyone, and why this is an issue that everyone needs to get behind. And yet, a week after that happened, there's no discussion anymore about the conditions. Nobody really has followed up to see, did it actually help? What are the conditions now? Are people accessing it? What have been the implications for those that have? Is this a permanent solution? Has it actually solved the problem? Or in the moment, did it just make us feel good? So I think there's lots of examples where we have had a bit of a reckoning and a recognition that there is action all of us needs to do in order to help everyone become more resilient and more successful within the structures that we have in our society. But will it be sustained? And I think that's the actual definition of our true resilience. Do we have the resilience to stick at the problems even after the immediate emergency crisis seems to have passed?
I fully agree with you, Lisa. In fact, I'm almost seeing as the next opening date. People are seeing it as that is a date we can put things behind us. And that should actually be the date that we start to say, what have we learned? It needs all of us, governments, private, and so on, to, first of all, I'm a big fan of engagement of people, but ask them, how did this affect you? What do we need to do to improve? How can we strengthen? I think that would be a necessary and important focus of government and private corporations in terms of how to build the better future. I do get concerned about people who say build back better. Like, to me, better is your ideology. I would like to see build back better based on what the groundswell of people are saying through engagement, and then we identify what better is.
I think one common challenge throughout this pandemic has been that we all tend to overestimate how much change it will actually bring about in human behavior. And as much as we look at the world through the lens of meaning, one of the things we find is even in cases where new meaning has developed and accelerated, like in the area of resiliency, people's understanding of what that is, yes, there have been, there's new knowledge developing in the marketplace among the average consumer, the average person. However, that change is still small, and there is a gap between knowledge development and doing, and that gap takes sometimes years to fill. So I think, I agree with you, Dave. I think this is a starting point of reflection, but we're still a few years away from really seeing tangible impact of this, if there is going to be one.
We're all using the word resilience, and we're using it as if it's something that we have all been blessed with. My sense of it is it has to be a learned and an acquired skill, if you want to call it that, or a muscle that we're developing, and that it's not necessarily something that's going to make life simpler moving forward. It's going to prepare us better to respond to difficult times. But, again, that's my own lens. Ujwal, where are we with that? It's a tough one, because the challenge is that on one hand, we've seen that the pandemic has made us a lot more numb to the plight of others. We've certainly seen that. And, despite new knowledge developing about the challenges with equity, about how, different people have less resources than most of us do in being able to take on the challenges that life presents to them. Despite that, we've also seen just as much of a rise in just a complete disregard for the experiences and the challenges that other people, especially people in lower income communities, marginalized communities, racialized communities, have experienced. And unfortunately, the two are going hand in hand, and that's not uncommon. We see that a lot, where there's two streams that just go in parallel in the opposite direction, but they develop in parallel.
I was going to say, I don't mind if some of these things are going to take a long time. I mean, society evolves over long periods of time. I think the thing that's the most helpful is to recognize that there's two different modes of responding to change. One is, and I'll use a healthcare analogy, one is acute. It's the emergency room treatment. It's, something is happening and we need to have everything thrown at it, and it's urgent, and it's an existential crisis. The other is chronic care management, where it's still serious. It could still kill the patient if it's not taken care of, but it needs to be taken care of over decades. And we need the fortitude and the resilience and the systems and the specialists and the way to be able to access it so that we can solve the problem in a way that doesn't burn us out, that doesn't demand an enormous amount of resources that is impossible to sustain, and actually leads to healthier and healthier outcomes over time. And I think part of the shift that we need to see is how can even just individuals in their own life shift from feeling like they're in the middle of the crisis where there's an emergency room situation about to happen any second, to taking what they've learned, to Dave's point, and incorporating it into, and how do I want to start to shift the way that I think about the meaning of things, as Ujwal has been introducing, over a long period of time. Let's take the pressure off to say we have to solve every problem by the end of this year or we've failed. Or, to Dave's point when we first started, if we can't solve it by the end of this year, let's throw our hands up and say it's too hard and back away from the problem. Let's give people the way to have a longer time horizon.
And I think that that's why We need to think carefully about the language that we use, and we need to think carefully about putting out dates. Like when we check the box, we can say that we're done. We are in a situation where adaptive management is required, and it's going to be required for as long as we can possibly imagine. And if we got people thinking and using that kind of language about what, and to your point, Ujjwal, what have we learned so far in this pandemic? What are we expecting to learn in the months coming up? Where are we going over the long term? And what do we need to do? And what do we need to stop doing? And I think that would be a much more useful and creative conversation that would actually lead us to more resilient, sustainable solutions than looking at it like, we've won the race, we can check the box and move on. All the language around the pandemic has been, like we're trying to win the race. We're trying to win the battle. It's not a battle. It's going to be an ongoing event.
All right, so we got a better understanding of what resilience is, and we heard Ujjwal Arkalgud, our cultural anthropologist, on that today. We got a better understanding of what pivot means because Lisa Taylor, so brilliant at kind of pinpointing some of this stuff for us. And Sarah got into this whole idea of the adaptive response and not only how it affects what we did in our personal lives, but our relationships and so on. And, again, Dave Hardy kind of taking us back into history where we should have learned from experiences like the blackout back in 2003, SARS 2003. We had all of this in front of us. So here's hoping that the next normals become a point where these are opportunities of learning. And that's where the resilience is really going to come from. We started talking about this, and it really is, I think what you were saying, is awareness.
And I think it's also this understanding and awareness that resilience is, again, it's not just one thing, it's a layered approach. So when we look at it through the lens that Dave brought to us with, what did we learn from SARS? What did we learn from the blackout? What did we learn from the ice storm? And then layer that on top of what we have learned through the COVID pandemic. What we see too, and this was a big aha for me in this episode, is that the next normal or pandemic recovery is, it's not a battle that is going to be fought and won with one particular event. It's not going to be, getting to that vaccination percentage point. It's not going to be getting X number of workers back into the office. None of that is going to signify the end. This is a moving target. It's an event that we're now living, and it's incredibly nuanced. But at the heart of that really is this understanding of adaptability and resilience, which I think lends itself to the next conversation we should have, which is our well-being. Because how can we be resilient when, the demographics mean that we have limited choices? Where we live impacts how we can make choices, how we can adapt, and how good our lives are. And I think that's really a big question that we need to start uncovering when we look at what the next normal is going to look like.
And so just let me paraphrase what you said about an event. To be clear, we're not going to have a Death Star explosion at the end of this.
I don't think so.
Right. All right, we'll leave it there. This is the next normal.
The Next Normal is sponsored by Challenge Factory, shaping the future of work.
By Decision Partners. Our world is a better place when we make better decisions.
By Motive Base, decoding implicit meaning behind what people talk about.
And by Hardy Stevenson and Associates, planning the cities of the future.
Comments, questions, or ideas for our hosts? Feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com.
This series is produced for the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.
This is SSN.